Picking up the story back in Second Chronicles, after Uzziah's death and his son Jotham takes over the throne at just 23 years old. He was one of the good kings of Judah. Verse 6 says, Jotham became mighty because he prepared his way before the Lord his God. He built up Judah and had many successful building projects and subdued the Ammonites. The Amorites, sorry. The Ammonites are gone. No, it's the Ammonites. The Amorites are the ones that are gone. After his death, his son Ahaz took over as king. Now, Ahaz is not a good king. Does it remind you of Ahab? Is there something about people with that name? Yeah, but Ahaz was not a good king. And we'll get to know more about him when we come back to Judah's story in a few days. Because remember that we're going chronologically, so we'll be bouncing around with from the prophecies and then the stories. I think that makes it even more interesting because it puts everything in a greater context. Moving along to the book of Isaiah, we read a lot about the messianic prophecies in the first part of chapter 9. The messianic king was to usher in the ideal age of peace. And in chapter 9, verse 7, we see the 4 titles of the Messiah made popular by the Hallelujah chorus. And when you were reading it, did it make you think about a Christmas carol or two? So we know him as the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now, we know that the prophecy was about Jesus, but the Israelites at the time had no idea. They were expecting a king, much like the kings that they have had, that would rescue them from the hands of the Assyrians. They were suffering greatly at the hands of the Assyrians, and they were expecting God to bring a mighty victory through a literal king. Little did they know that it was much, much more, what they could never even fathom. And it wouldn't be until centuries later that Jesus would actually come to earth. But if only they knew that it was much more than deliverance from enemies, but from salvation, true salvation of all our souls. Not just for them, but for foreigners, for everyone, including Gentiles. Because remember, in this time, the focus really is on the children of Israel. God used Assyria to judge his people, but Isaiah clearly revealed that even Assyria also would be judged. This must have been confusing even for them, because surely victory in a battle shows who was on the winning side. So if Assyria was winning, it will show that it would indicate that they were on God's side. But God is saying that he will judge Assyria as well. The war was literally between 2 groups who opposed God, the godless Israelites and the Assyrians, who were more or less pagans. In all of this, there was to be a remnant that will return to the land. God had a plan to rescue them from the enemy he sent to purify them. And Isaiah said as much. Chapter 11 spoke in detail about the Messianic King, Jesus, who would delight in doing the will of the Father, rule with equity, and bring a time of peace and harmony even between natural enemies. And didn't that remind you of like the Garden of Eden, when they talked about how the lamb will lay down with the lion and the child will put the hand in the cobra's nest and nothing will happen? Like, I cannot wait for those days to come. Chapter 12 is a joyful response of the Lord's people in anticipation of a future day when he'll deliver them. After the disciplining judgment of the Lord was passed, his people would look to him in praise and trust him as their salvation. Now, here's what I learned about God from reading these chapters. If there were any doubts about Jesus' return, 11:11 shows, or rather confirms, some of the things that we'll read, or we will read in Revelation. And if you have read Revelation, you would be familiar with. Jesus is that root of Jesse, whose resting place shall be glorious. Jesus will come again to recover the remnant of the people who are left, not just from the Lord's people, but also from the Gentiles. There's a future deliverance to look forward to for all of God's people. So despite whatever judgment or whatever we think that we're going through, this is not the end. How amazing is it to know this? Thank you for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow with more lessons, and we'll be reading the book of Micah. And with that, we'll finish our 20th book of the Bible. So Micah 1 to 7, get ready. See you here. Bye.